there's water on them.
Oh, great. Yeah, you made me nervous. Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Veronica, for the invitation. When Veronica called me to invite me to do this, it was kind of the next step in a series of surprises, including the invitation from Eastern New Mexico University, because I've kind of gone, this far in my life, having written since I was a kid and published a book and a lot of short stories, and I never thought of myself as a writer, and it's really been only in the last 2 years that I'm a writer. So I didn't really think in those terms until recently. So this has been kind of a nice series of invitations that I've gotten lately. So, and I'd also like to introduce my daughter, Isabella, right there, who's also a writer and avid reader. She's a truly wonderful person. My son couldn't come, and as those of you who know him, he's a master of the spoken word already at 8. And it doesn't matter what it is, just he talks all the time. So, okay, I wanted to kind of go with a theme instead of jump around to a lot of different works. And one of the things that I'm really interested in and have been for a long time is people who are on the move, but not of their own free will necessarily. And that's because, I started traveling when I was 16 years old. I went to Peru, and I've been fortunate enough to travel a lot. And all along the way, while I've been traveling, I meet people who are also traveling, but they don't want to necessarily be traveling, or they're traveling and they want to be traveling because they're seeking opportunity. But they are illegal, whereas I was not illegal. And this was really driven home to me on the bus in southern Morocco one time when I stood with my ticket, got on a bus with some guys from Senegal, and they were the same age as I was and dressed not too differently, and they were heading north to Europe, and they had purchased a ticket, and we got on the bus, and after a couple hours we were pulled over by the Moroccan military. All the men were taken off the bus, and the men from Senegal were hauled off. And because they were illegal, they were doing the exact same thing that I was doing, but they were illegal, and I wasn't. And it started to really make me think about these disparities between the haves and the have-nots, I guess you could say, and who can move and who can't. A rich Mexican can come to the United States whenever they want, and a rich guy from Congo can fly to Europe whenever he wants. And the rich don't necessarily need to move, but the people who do need to move to find work or to find opportunity, they're the ones who can't move. And I've been really troubled by this over the past year as we hear these people in need who get demonized and taken advantage of. These are people who need help, and yet they're being further taken advantage of for political purposes. And I find that just extremely bothersome. And I'm working on an article right now, a feature article for a magazine about European Union migration policies, which very much mirror our own, in that they actually create illegality. You become illegal by the sign of a pen, and then you're hunted. And that's what we do to people from Central America, and that's what the Europeans do to people from West Africa and now the Middle East. So that's very bothersome to me, and it's something that I've kind of been obsessed with for several decades now. So I wanted to kind of go with that theme of people who are in places where maybe they didn't necessarily want to end up. And so I've got 3 stories, and the last one will come home to New Mexico. So the first story is called Majupi, and it's from Macedonia. And just the situation of how this worked out is I was in Macedonia in the winter of 2004, and I met this American woman, and she said, there's these kids in Kosovo who are this extreme small minority called Ashkali, and they're gypsies, but they're a particular group of gypsies, or Roma. They're not Roma, they're Ashkali. And anyway, she said, there's these clothes, they need to get these clothes for Christmas. And I said, well, she said, would you like to help? Yeah, I'd like to help. She says, go stand out on the highway near Skopje, and there'll be this bus. And this German woman's going to get off the bus, and she's going to have 15 big bags. And then you stay there with the bags, and then this truck is going to come, and it's going to pick you up, and it's going to take you to Kosovo, and you put the bags in the thing and go and deliver the bags. And anyway, it was like blinding snow and 2 in the morning when the German lady showed up with her big bags. And anyway, so I went to Kosovo and delivered these bags to these refugees, and then they said, well, back in Macedonia is some of our family, but they're separated by like 30 miles, but they couldn't communicate. And so they said, well, please go visit them when you get back to Macedonia. So that's where this story originated. Kaplanovo sat deep in the mountains. The buildings of the summer camp dormitories were pale blue and spread into a stand of cypress and pine. The air was hazy and orange and completely still. In front of the gate, a Macedonian police officer sat in a cramped hut playing cards with a group of Ashkali children. His Lada 2107 sat just outside. He had steak-like jowls and thin lips. Majupi, he said, and thrust his chin toward the building. The children berated him, and he grinned. I handed over my passport as he requested, and I walked through the gates. The paths through the snow were knee-deep and narrow, and like spider webs, as if everyone walked in single file all the time. 4 Ashkali men stood next to the empty UNHCR shack smoking and looking at their shoes. Several women huddled under a blanket watching. A group of children played soccer in an iced-over field. Their laughter and shouts echoed off the dormitory walls. Their foggy breath hung in the air like confusion. Through the curtains, a family crowded in the dim light of a single bulb. They were languid like smoked bees. Plastic hair clips held back the lace curtains. The television mumbled, and posters of Enrique Iglesias and Britney Spears lined the wall. The floor was covered with a giant rug. Neatly arrayed pillows traced the walls. The air was warm and scented with cabbage and paprika. I gave them some coffee in a steel can and a bag of Dove hand soap. The grandfather had been stressed about his son, the oldest of 7, but he was trying to let go. He'd not heard from the young man since they had crossed the border from Kosovo. The grandmother was stressed also about everything. Money, food, heat, a roof. These were things forever in doubt. She was very dark and with sharp features. She was so beautiful I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. She made me a cup of tea on a butane stove. One of the daughters had a husband in jail. Their son was 5 months old. He couldn't hold his head up by himself and was clearly blind. She was detached and sat on a pillow staring at the wall. The grandfather was attentive to the boy despite his worry. Chit chee 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 chit chee chee chee, he sang and tickled the boy's neck. The boy cooed and smiled, and the grandfather did it again. The hallway was lined with laundry, and the toilet was a hole outside. In the next room sat a man and his wife and 4 girls. The little one's name translated as, "How beautiful is freedom." She was born in a plastic tent at the border in a baking summer heat. The room was very similar to that of the first family, but for the coffee table and 2 stools. This second family had lived as refugees in Jokkmokk in Sweden for 18 months in the 1990s. That time they were fleeing with the Kosovars from the Serbs. This time they were fleeing from the Kosovars. Sweden didn't want them back, even though they both spoke the language solidly. The wife was anxious, the man was angry. I had a successful business, he shouted in Swedish. They burned it twice. Now I send my children to Skopje every day for education. Education, education, that's everything, he shouted. His wife bit her nails. But they don't want Majupi children to succeed. They don't want us. My girl makes a perfect paper and she gets fewer points than a perfect paper made by Macedonian girls. Why? Majupi. Can you live on 200 euros a month when your rent is 100? What was your business, I asked. Bookbinding, he said. What's your business? I'm here to take pictures. You're not taking pictures. Oh. You tell me, why do Kosovars get refugee status in 3 months, and for us, nothing in 5 years? Because Macedonia prostitutes itself to the EU money, and K4 troops sell Kosovar girls for prostitutes. Majupi, Majupi, that's all we are. In the evening it snowed again. There were boys next to the old Turkish bridge. The restaurants in Skopje were loud and full. I ate fish with carrots and parsley in a restaurant on the west side of the city, across the Treska River. So that's that one.
Wow.
So the next one comes from Finland, where Isabella is half Finnish, my daughter, who's hiding over there like... Okay, so right before Isabella was born, I walked the length of Finland from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic Ocean, 5-month backpacking trip, and along the way I met a lot of people who are very interesting, and I'm going to go into that. But so a couple things about this story, just to set it up, is a couple words. Pula is a Finnish word for like a sweet baked good that you have in mid-morning. Pula. And a puukko is the knife, is the handmade knives that Finns carry, a traditional thing, and some people still carry them, and some people don't. And then the other thing is, in the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and the Finns, the war only lasted 3 months, but the Finns killed probably 1 million Russian soldiers in that time. And even though they won on the battlefield, they lost politically. They got traded away. And it's kind of a mythological thing amongst Finns, this war. And so you meet people all the time who talk about how they were in the war. And, now that it's getting on 80 years ago, sometimes you meet certain people and you're like, you weren't even born, and then sometimes you meet folks who they're old enough to have seen what they saw, and you don't know if you believe them or not, but you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, because the suffering in that was huge, and it's hard to be disrespectful of that. So this story is called The Value of the Earth, and it takes place exactly right in central Finland. I came to Jorkuna before the day was hot. Veikko arrived at the same time and sat in his lada, smoking a cigarette. There was a store at Jorkuna, a square yellow building and a sloping roof and newspapers in the windows. Behind it was an abandoned wooden house, painted a deep rusty red. Buttercup and red clover came up through the cracks in the asphalt. Geraniums grew in a long white plastic window box that hung just below the windows. They blossomed a brilliant red. The rye in the fields was not yet ripe. The store owner was a round, middle-aged woman who pursed her lips when she smiled. Her hands were long and slender and beautiful. She had been trained as a pastry chef. On a box of apples and in wicker baskets, she had arranged cinnamon rolls, danishes, croissants, and glazed strawberries that glittered in the sun. That's sure pulled out. There was coffee in a silver thermos, paper cups, and a bowl of sugar. The milk was ice cold. I took a cinnamon roll and a coffee. She refused my money. "They aren't for sale, they're for eating," she said, and pursed her lips. I thanked her, picked them up, and went outside to sit at a wooden table and look at my maps. Veiko continued to smoke. A gray van arrived, and a thin, weather-beaten man with a tired mouth and loose jeans climbed down and went into the store. His wife stayed in the van and shouted for him to bring an ice cream. She was impossibly fat and struggled to breathe. She was all sweaty. Other cars pulled up in front of the store, and the fat lady shouted instructions to the drivers. They ignored her. The thin man reappeared with 2 ice cream cones. He gave them both to the lady, then returned to the store. Veiko came, introduced himself to me, and sat down beside me. "Where are you going?" "Oulu," I said. "From where?" "Suomi Salmi. Rate, actually, at the Russian border." Veiko knew Rate. "I was at Rate during the war," he said. He said that he turned 18 in October of 1939 and immediately joined the army. When the Russians came, he mowed them down with his water-cooled Maxim machine gun and left them in piles to bleed to death on the snow. In the morning, he took his puukko and slit the throats of the ones left alive. That's how Veiko knew the Rate Road. He said that he prayed they would stop coming, but each night they came, and each night he killed more. And in the spring he was at Taipale, and he ran when they broke the line. He wasn't scared, he said. He was tired of killing, but he didn't stop running until Seinäjoki. The Ostrobotnians know. They ran all the way to Vasa. He smiled at his joke, and I didn't understand it. A woman came on a bike with a metal basket. There was a dog in the basket. It was fuzzy and brown with a pink bow in its ear. "Looking at maps, looking at maps. Men are always looking at maps." She shook her head sorrowfully and went into the store. "I'm walking," I said. "The best thing is to walk," Veiko replied and went inside. I sat in the sun and drank the coffee. The cinnamon roll was hot and fresh. The fat woman continued to shout orders and berated a young German couple for trying to use the broken gas pump. The thin man brought her a 3rd ice cream, and he returned to the store. "Make it licorice next time," she hollered after him. The morning quickly grew hot, and children appeared on bikes. They too bought ice cream. No one else took one of the fresh pastries. Veiko returned with a small bag of groceries. He asked me what I had seen walking from Rate. "Yesterday I met a family of Vietnamese gathering blueberries near Sarkiari. They must have had 50 or 60 liters." "Yes," he said, 2 Estonian women take cloudberries near Pelo in Lapland. They call me in September on their way home, and I buy several liters from them. There is nothing better than cloudberries and vanilla ice cream." He smiled softly. "Does it bother you, so many foreigners coming to Finland?" I asked him. "No," he said. "Why should it? It's God's earth, not mine. I'm just here for a few years. It doesn't belong to me. Who am I to say you can come or you cannot? No, it's not my place to say." Then he smoked another cigarette, climbed into his Lada, and drove towards Sarkiari. The store owner came out, pursed her lips at me, and asked, "Are you from Michigan?" "New Mexico," I said. "Does New Mexico look like Michigan?" "I don't think so. I've never been there, but I imagine it looks more like Finland than New Mexico." My husband was born in Michigan. His parents emigrated to America, but they didn't like it. They came back when he was 5 years old. I always wondered what Michigan looked like, but I think life in Finland is better. She pursed her lips and returned to the store. That evening I slept in a room above a bar that smelled like vomit. Mickey Mouse posters hung on the wall, and drunken men stumbled in and out under the midnight sun.
Wow.
Should I do one more?
One more.
Okay. So this is one that I wrote for New Mexico Magazine. that's about New Mexico, and just my only caveat with it is it's not, you know, when you send your stuff off to a magazine, then they edit it. So I feel like it's lost a little bit of my voice, but it still kind of goes with the theme. It's called Digging In. By the time I woke, my body temperature had dropped to the point that I was shivering violently. I rolled over into the fetal position, and my sleeping bag squished. Someone was calling my name. I could hear rain. Then my little pup tent collapsed around me. Outside, people were yelling and scattering among the pinon and juniper. The sky was pink except for the bolts of lightning breaking the night, careening overhead and crashing into the ponderosas on a hill across the valley. There were piles of hail a foot deep and a watery muck that floated up past my ankles. Then those lofty cotton candy clouds opened up with a tremendous dump of large, wet snowflakes. By the time I'd found my boots, I was caught in a full-on blizzard and couldn't stop shaking. The only clothes around were a sopping pair of shorts and a muddy flannel. Throwing them on, I raced for the trucks parked somewhere out in the night. It was springtime in New Mexico. At 21 years old, I was a dropout from the University of New Mexico archaeological program. What am I doing here? I sat in class and wondered, what am I doing here? I'd gotten it in my head that I could learn far more working out on a real live archaeological project. After months of shameless begging, one of the crew chiefs took pity. I was hired onto a team surveying a path of a giant proposed oil and gas pipeline running from Albuquerque to the Four Corners with branches to Gallup, Chama, and on to southwestern Colorado. I was an employee of Enron. The problem from the start was simple. The Texas oil executives who traced that pipeline path across the map of our state had never walked the land. They had no idea what they were getting into. They had no idea what they were getting us into. The pipeline was pointed through some of the wildest, roughest, and most archaeologically rich land in all of North America. 2 weeks later, the snow had melted, the mud had nearly cemented, and a searing wind was blowing out of the southwest. Springtime in New Mexico. Our truck overheated, so our little crew of 10 walked northeast through thick stands of pinon and juniper trees along the proposed pipeline route looking for help. The path was a dusty red. We could see north to the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, west to the Chuscas in Arizona, and east to the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range near Taos. The crew trudging down the path that day was a microcosm of New Mexico. There was a Diné from Shiprock, a guy from Isleta Pueblo, a relocated rocker from Chicago, a gun lover from Indiana, a mouthy New Yorker who would go on to become a respected New Mexico archaeologist, a Hispanic from a defunct farming village, a former cowboy, and a very serious PhD candidate. Eventually we came to a squat hogan and a single wide, crunched up tight against a ruddy sandstone cliff and surrounded by fat little junipers. The man who answered the trailer door wasn't thrilled, but he welcomed us with fry bread straight from the cast iron skillet, a bowl of meaty stew, and a horrific cup of coffee. When his wife arrived, she wagged her finger. There are ghosts all over out there. People have been living and dying out there for 50,000 years. You're stirring up them ghosts, she said. I don't think this is a good idea. This is not a good idea. A few weeks later, while we were excavating an ancestral Pueblo site, one of the pipeline workers from Oklahoma drove up and sincerely wanted to know, why'd those Indians build their homes way out here, so far from the cities? I guess he couldn't comprehend that back 1,000 years ago, some of the remote parts of New Mexico were far more heavily populated than they are now. He couldn't comprehend that where we have cities now was not where people from 1,000, 2,000, or 5,000 years ago built their towns or villages. And he wasn't the only one. The Texas oil executives certainly didn't understand it. Seemingly, neither did the project managers at the University of New Mexico. How could they not know all this was out here? The whole project ground to a snail's pace. Our crew was finding archaeological sites no one had ever recorded before. In fact, we couldn't walk more than a quarter mile without running into another new site, and then another, and then another. And by law, each site in the path of the pipeline had to be properly mapped, photographed, recorded, and ultimately excavated before the pipeline could be built. Poor management was not my concern, however. I was perhaps more content than I'd ever been. Growing up in southern Colorado with a New Mexico enchanted family meant that we often headed south to explore. But for some reason, I wasn't ever taken with New Mexico like the rest of my family. And what are we doing here often crossed my lips. I wasn't asking that anymore, though. By May, I had stopped returning to Albuquerque on my days off. I was less and less interested in the girlfriend waiting for me in the city, and increasingly desirous to spend my free days along the back roads, hiking into long-lost ruins, and talking to the other New Mexicans I met along the way. There was a very large Pueblo ruin buried in the caliche and sand near an empty spot on a map called Ram Mesa out on the Navajo Nation. There didn't appear to be anyone living nearby, but every morning an enterprising kid would show up with a cooler full of hot, fresh burritos. And he made a fortune from us, and then he disappeared back into the cliffs and the canyons. That site spread out around the base of the mesa, and it took months to map and excavate. It was full of pottery styles from all over the Southwest. The people who had lived there traded with others in Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Colorado, and possibly beyond. It was slated to be torn up when the pipeline crews came through. And it is torn up. It's been destroyed. Day by day, I slowly learned to look over the landscape and see where the towns and the villages would have been, and how the ancient New Mexicans would have used the land to alter watercourses, grow food, harvest trees, and travel. That land came completely to life as I spent more time out there, and the layers of history became clearly visible to me. So did my place in that history, and I couldn't feel anything except humility. And then in July, the monsoon arrived. And we could see it coming, because for weeks the thunderheads built up every afternoon to the southwest. Then you could smell it, the sweetness of tropical moisture beginning to dominate the tang of the desert dust. And one day the sky went dark so fast, we raced to cover up the site and get to camp, but we were too late. Coyote Canyon, a painfully sere little wash, normally so dry that even cactus went there to die, filled to the brim with a dangerous red muddy flood, and we spent the night sleeping in the trucks without our gear. And it rained for weeks. On an October morning, I woke warm and dry in a new 3-season tent. I lay there and listened to the gentle hiss of the snow falling outside. Someone had a fire going and then a pot of coffee. My equipment was better. I'd come to terms with living outside on the land in New Mexico. You had to be prepared for anything. Later that morning, our crew drove the highway to a small excavation site we'd found just northwest of Cuba, New Mexico. A great owl darted from the sage and made for the highway. A truck cruising from the opposite direction clipped the owl, and it spun against the asphalt and into the brush. I wrapped it in my coat and carried it to our truck. And it died. Right there in my hands, it died. And it wasn't sad. I wasn't sad. I was amazed. And holding that bird and looking across the snowy sagebrush flats of the Jicarilla lands, the whole year filled my head at once, and it was all about amazement, every bit of it. There was the vastness of the land, the perfectly sweet summer mornings, the soft winds that broke the heat and the harsh winds that bent you to your knees, the rains you could see coming from miles off, the powerful sun, the friends, the sweaty work, the discoveries, the seemingly endless drives, the hikes to places no cars could go. What am I doing here was no longer a question without an answer. New Mexico wasn't a choice for me. It was something that happened to me, and home was the answer.
Yeah, why don't you two sit?
Yeah.